A very good morning to everyone, and thank you for being here for my talk. So the title of the paper today is Sounding Singapore, Sound as Cultural Heritage. So historian Alan Corbin stresses how citizens' habitus condition their ways of listening. Sound does not only resonate with the cultural realities of a society, community, or country, but shapes its practices and policies. So in an attempt to comprehend the acoustic ecologies of Singapore and the impact on lived experiences, I will examine sound as a means of accessing and understanding society's cultural and political realities. It is thus an inquiry into Singapore's sonicities and soundmarks, but it is also concerned with the hermeneutic dimension of these soundscapes. So this paper presents the findings from a small-scale study that was done that sought to ascertain the importance of sonicity for Singapore residents and what Singapore's soundmarks are. These findings are evaluated for their epistemological significance in relation to recent sound events that reveal how sounds, in their dramatization and reception, reflect as they determine the cultural and political life worlds and lived experiences of Singaporeans. So as part of a research grant study, 200 Singapore residents were surveyed between February to July 2021 to gather information on the value of sound in everyday experiences and what they believed were sounds that characterized Singapore's life worlds. So 4 questions were posed, as you can see there on the screen. How attentive are you usually to the sounds around you? Are the sounds around you significant or important to you? What are some of the sounds that are distinct in your residential neighborhood or the area where you work or study? And how long have you been living, working, or studying in that location mentioned in the second question? Have you noticed any changes in the types of sounds there? And the final question is, what do you think are the sounds that are unique to Singapore? So an inductive content analysis approach was taken to identifying themes and concepts across specific survey data. 3 thematic headings were generated on respondents' attitudes to their sonic environment after responses were transcribed and scanned for semantically equivalent words. So for example, some spoke about their preferences for soothing or relaxing environments as opposed to feelings of irritation and dislike when they hear loud noises. These phrases were then grouped into the constructed unit of meaning of sound's function to influence the mood of the listener. Relative to sound's emotional dimension was how these reactions were often paired with respondents' aim to be productive. These sounds distract them and decrease their effectiveness to carry out a range of tasks like working or studying. More than the impact on concentration, respondents also cited how their perceived quality of sounds shapes the ambience of a setting. The character of a place is determined by this pervading mood that is associated with its varying emotional responses to factors like noise levels, sound types, presence of music, and even participant etiquette. Subfunctions were then abstracted to form the main thematic heading of sound's affective function. The other 2 thematic categories that were generated after the above coding process was repeated were A, spatial awareness. A common thread in the responses was how respondents thought of sound as sensory information that allowed them to position themselves, know what is near them, and alert them if there was danger around. And the second is embodied experience of memory, where respondents revealed the embeddedness of the familiar and or remembered sounds in their daily lives, which form their sonic expectations. So identified sound marks of Singapore also tallied and ranked based on modality to find out which were the most common sounds that respondents felt uniquely represents cultural identities. Data sets were tabulated across age groups, gender, and ethnicity to identify meaningful patterns between respondents' frames, expectations, and meanings they have toward their sonic environment. These trends were extrapolated and expanded to discuss possible themes and to provide a deeper understanding of the experiences of Singapore's soundscapes. So in relation to the first question, as you see up there, about the attention to sound, 54% of respondents said they always or frequently paid attention to the sounds around them, while 46% said they sometimes or never give much attention to them. When asked to identify what are some of the distinct sounds in their residential neighborhood or the place where they work or study, many took some time to recall, proving how sounds have become keynotes and naturalized as part of their everyday lived experiences. This finding is quite significant because it reveals how almost 1 in 2 persons living here do not regard sound as a significant way of conscious knowing, of revealing experiential truth. Sound is regarded primarily as functional or effective, something that one has to negotiate with daily. Responses to the follow-up question reveal this as well. So 40.5% cited that sound has mainly an informational or functional purpose. So for example, as previously mentioned, it's a way to alert them to danger or to provide information on activities around so they know how to respond accordingly. 58.4% believe sound evokes emotional responses, be it positive or negative ones. And 28.3% says sound impacts concentration, thereby affecting their productivity and focus at work study. The data reflects a cultural pragmatism that is characteristic of Singaporeans. Singapore's political climate has always been based on pragmatism. That ideology, which constructs much of social policy and practice, has impacted not just Singaporeans' lived experiences, but also their ears, of how they listen and what they listen to, and of what is sonically meaningful and what is not. Sound is regarded functionally or as a means of evaluating productivity. The types of sound respondents revealed to be soundmarks also reflected deeply the physical realities of living in a densely urban populated country and in a multicultural society, the second of which I will speak more subsequently. So the koala bird, as you can see here, bird sounds and the koala bird in particular are the most characteristic sounds that are ranked in third in ranking. The remaining sounds identify archetypal of urban sounds. So it seems that only the bird songs were a bit unusual. So the archetypal urban sounds, urban soundscapes include street noise, traffic, and sounds from transportation modes and systems. And these happen to top the list. Construction sounds, interestingly, ranked sixth. How respondents regarded sounds of cultural value revealed the highly urbanized built-up environment with relative absence of nature or of hinterland sounds. Additionally, construction of roads, tunnels, houses is a ubiquitous sight in Singapore. So it is unsurprising that the sounds of construction ranked quite highly up there. 9 of the top 10 themes were then urban sounds amidst what could be an acoustic ecology like any other metropolitan city. With relentless urbanization, the dominant soundscape experienced by city dwellers is increasingly homogeneous and lo-fi. Sound is distinctly revelatory of a state's political life world as well. And this is where I'll speak more about multiculturalism and sound. So in Singapore, multiculturalism is one of the city-state's core foundational socio-political principles that further determines many of the government's policies, from education to housing and the rule of law. It is the belief that different ethnic groups can and will live and work together as a united, cohesive people, and no particular cultural heritage or ethnicity, religious identity will precede the national identity and the nation's shared values. And for the government, race can be categorically and simplistically determined to be Chinese, Malay, Indian, or if you're not either of the three, it's classified as others. While the state advances the principle, which encompasses multi-religiosity, primarily through visual signifiers such as ethnic costumes, religious festivals, skin color, multiculturalism, as we know, has an acoustic dimension as well. So respondents of the survey reflected how the multilingual announcement made in public train station was the most distinctive soundmark that reflected Singapore identity. While the interplay of different languages, Singlish and the Singapore accent was the next most recognizable soundmark. Sounds associated with religious practices and ceremonies such as church bells, chants, calls to prayer at mosques were placed 7th. So while along this course can be written about the acoustic dimensions of multicultural practice in Singapore, I'll examine a particular religious ceremony whose sacred sounds have been regulated and restricted by the government. The Hindu Thaipusam festival is an annual ritual procession practiced by Singapore's Tamil Indian minority population, and it commemorates the Hindu deity Lord Subramaniam, otherwise known as Lord Murugan. The rite involves a procession of devotees carrying a kavadi, as you see there in the image, an elaborately decorated semicircular frame made from steel and wood, and in which in some designs has segments that are pierced into the flesh of the bearer, who supposedly feels no pain, for he is sustained by faith. So there are also studies about how these kavadi bearers are in sort of a trance. So these kavadi bearers, along with devotees, proceed in colorful procession along public roads accompanied by music and drumming, sacred sounds that are meant to sustain the devotees and create a soundscape of devotion. Religious foot processions are not permitted by law. Thaipusam is an exception. The conditions for dispensing this exception include a ban on live music and drumming, a restriction that has been in place since 1973, after fights between rival groups broke out, and music was used as a means of sonic competition, thereby evidencing music's capacity to inspire disorderly behavior. This restriction has, however, eased in the recent years through regulation, including the type of instruments and volume of play. Regulation, including the type of instruments and volume of play, are still in place. Critically considered, the ban reflects how Hindu sacred sound is metonymic of danger and considered noise pollution. In its practice, the religious is confronted by the secular in public space, where sound cannot be effectively contained. So Sykes observes how some hear Hindu processional drumming as crossing the chasm between public and private, and thus being an unnecessary disruption of the public marketplace by communal culture. Distinctly, there is conflict between governmental understandings of what sacred sounds can do and notions articulated by religious traditions that come to be defined in the public sphere as ethnic heritage. So the ban on live music and drumming was lifted in 2016. Prior to this, no live music in any form was permitted. However, in 2016, live music stipulated static points were permitted, so static points along the procession. In 2019, after taking feedback from Singapore's Hindu community, authorities decided to allow for an earlier start time for music to be played and increased the number of static points from 23 to 35. So in 2016, there were only 3 live music points. Additionally, since 2019, more instruments have been played or were permitted to be played through though amplification is still not allowed. Instruments such as the ganjira and one of either a tavul, dol, or kol could now be played. So these are the drums that you see in the image there. So such distinctions are also true of sacred Islamic music, or say Islamic sounds rather. In all Islamic communities, the loudspeaker, radio, and television are integral to the traditional call to prayer, or the azan. The azan is a sound mark of the Muslim life world. While older mosques in Singapore, those built before 1975, had loudspeakers that faced outwards of the mosque, those built after 1975 were compelled by law to have speakers face the interior of the building. With urbanization and with multicultural practice in view, there was a need for new considerations of the soundscapes of shared spaces, for sacred sonicities were regarded as intrusive to those outside that community. In another survey done in 2019 by the Institute of Policy Studies, an independent think tank that studies and generates public policy ideas in Singapore, religious chanting or praying were among the loud events at void decks and common areas where members of the public were put off by. The survey reveals how new urban social setup had caused sound production to sometimes be regarded as intrusive by those not involved in that religion or those particular events. Such sonic politics has obviously not escaped controversy or interrogation by some Singaporeans who have criticized the censoring of sacred sounds as possibly racist or discriminatory. These netizens note how sounds of the cymbals and drums of lion dances, a characteristic feature of the Chinese New Year, the singing of Christmas carols in public spaces, the loud rhythms of the kompang, which is a Malay drum, the kompang heard at during processional Malay weddings are not prohibited, so these are permitted. These events take place in public spaces as well, but are permitted to continue despite the supposed noise that can occur. The government, however, articulates its defense with a threadbare distinction between religious celebrations and social and community and non-religious celebrations. So social celebrations can involve music, song, and drumming, but religious ceremonies, or some in particular, those that whose rites involve public processions, must manage sonic output. The justification for this tenuous distinction between religious and social and cultural is founded on the belief that religious ceremonies carry a particular sensitivity, with the risks of incidents considered to be higher. But of course, authorities are vague on what they mean by risk of incidents, or why that's to be higher in the first place. So to conclude, even as Singapore is regarded as a global exemplar of contemporary multicultural practice in which races and religions coexist harmoniously, such auditory events resound with a contrasting reality. Complaints about religious sacred sounds reverberate with frequencies of difference and absent orality, a lack of active sonorous understanding. As Sachs observes, a society's soundscape then may consist of multiple overlapping soundscapes containing contrasting definitions of sonic efficacy, of the characteristics and possibilities for sacred sounds in public space, and of personhood. So lived multiculturalism, as opposed to state multiculturalism, is in Singapore more accurately defined as practice tolerance through a fierce possession of the right to not be harassed and to keep a safe space or safe distance from the other. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Hello. I've had a couple of stays in Singapore before COVID. Really enjoyed it. The sound I remember most from there was actually a free concert of Yemeni music in the foyer of the concert hall, which was rather unexpected to me, but was wonderful. But what I was going to ask you about was the proportion of sounds which were important or unimportant to people, but what proportion of sounds are what we might call aural pollution? Is that a significant problem in a bustling city-state like Singapore?
Oh yeah, interestingly enough, a newspaper report just came out a few days, about 2 weeks ago, about increasing prevalence of noise that residents have been complaining, and I think the number of complaints about noise either from neighbors around them or street noise has increased by I think 35 or 36%. So I think after COVID, the kind of silence that we experienced had an impact on the general community and the population. And now that things are back to what they were pre-COVID, people seem to be uncomfortable with the kind of noise levels that we used to, or that we were familiar with. So you are right in many senses. What we consider to be unacceptable sounds or noise is one of the prevalent features that our society has been dealing with. So a new committee has been set up, I think last year, to look into this issue and to revise the laws regarding and the regulations regarding acceptable noise levels. And in fact, in Singapore, we are dangerously close to the World Health Organization's acceptable noise level of 70 decibels. So I think generally speaking, the average noise levels are about 69.4%. So that's really close. And it's certain locations in Singapore that exceed 70 actually. It goes up to 75 or 76 decibels. So yes, noise seems to be, or unacceptable sounds or sounds that are less tolerated seem to be a characteristic that people are paying more and more attention to. So yes, thank you for your question. I hope that answers it.